was born in South Africa, in a small semi-rural area called Ndaleni, in the Midlands of KwaZulu-Natal. By the time I was born, in 1960, the Nationalist Party had been in power for 12 years. When they got into power, they instituted the apartheid policy, which was really about white superiority. So we're going to be segregated according to races, white people on top, Indian, colored, black African at the bottom. They proceeded to enact a litany of legislation to make sure that this happens. The resources were taken from black people and given to white people. Land is an example. Where I grew up, from time to time there would be stories, we're going to be moved, and then it would die down. A few years later, it would come up again. The apartheid government in the mid-60s was spending in the mid-70s was spending 644 rands, which is equivalent to $49, on educating a white child, versus 42 rand, which is equivalent to $3 on educating a black child. And signs like this were signs that we saw on a daily basis growing up, for exclusive use of white persons, as well as the other signs, the black only, Indian, colored. So in the little area where I grew up, in Ndaleni, there were sayings that you would hear on a regular basis, without anyone batting an eyelid. So I'll read them to you just now. So, umdala umlungu, the white person is wise. Umuhle njengomlungu, you're as beautiful as a white person. Ucabanga njengomlungu, you think like a white person. Umlungu akalali. A white person is hardworking. Now, as I said, this was part of our language. No one bat an eyelid, no one said, what are you saying? It was part of our language. And actually, I got to know that there are similar sayings in other languages in South Africa, in different languages. And then there is one, which is like a shorthand. It's hardly ever said in full. It's usually just said, umntomnyama, and it ends there. Which in English is the blacks. But if you know the context, it's usually umntomnyama uyavilapha, black person is lazy. Umntomnyama akahlakaniphile, black person is not intelligent. Umntomnyama akafundile, a black person is not educated. Umntomnyama akaphucuzekile, a black person is not civilized. So all these messages were about white is good and superior, and black is bad and inferior. And in fact, everything in our environment proved that. So there was no reason to doubt those messages. We lived them on a daily basis. So life under apartheid was hard. It was a struggle. Struggling to kind of stay alive, because if you did anything that's against the law, your life would be in danger. So we were told, get an education. And education is the key to a better life, marginally better life, because segregation would still be there. But what I also realized as I've grown up now is that part of that process was assimilating us into whiteness. So we didn't see ourselves in the books as they were talking about earlier. You saw whiteness everywhere, and that was the standard that we were meant to aspire to. So the high school that I went to, which was an all-girls black boarding school, we were not allowed to speak indigenous languages during the week. We could only speak those on the weekend, and we had to speak English during the week. So, of course, there was pressure on the government to change its policies. And then we got to a point where there was transition. There was pressure inside, pressure outside. The international community, everyone put pressure on the government, so that by 1991, the apartheid legislation was repealed. And I think the whole world watched us as we got excited when we had our first democratic elections, and Nelson Mandela was elected as the first president of a democratic South Africa. Then there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whose job it was really to provide a space for people who had suffered gross human rights violations to be able to tell their stories, to be able to get to know about what happened to their families, so that they could find closure and healing. And hopefully that as South Africa we would reconcile. Now that was an amazing process, and I think people who participated in that to different degrees found that really useful and possibly healing. But it wasn't for everyone. So for regular people like me, there was nothing that was helping us to transition. So those messages that we heard growing up, nothing had changed. Okay, so we could vote. Okay, so maybe we could go to some institutions we couldn't before. But those messages were still very much a part of our identity. But then, of course, we're a rainbow nation, we're excited, we're looking forward to this. The world was looking at us and thinking, yay, South Africa did it without violence. So life went on. And then in 2001, I had an opportunity to visit Ghana to be trained as a trainer. So let me tell you a little bit about Ghana. So Ghana was colonized by the British, but it had got its independence in 1957. So it had been independent for longer than I was alive. So you can imagine my excitement to go to Ghana, to be in this amazing African country, to really just like breathe the air of this free country. And also to mix with other African women, an opportunity that we didn't have before 1994. But I had an experience in Ghana that was to change the course of my career. So I get to Ghana, I'm really excited, meeting everyone, we start the training. So on one of the days, our trainer says, okay, you're going to work in groups, find a place to work and work in groups. So the group that I was part of, they decide to leave the room and find a place to work outside. So as we were walking, my group member said, okay, let's sit on the porch there, on the veranda of the hotel. So let me set the scene for you. So this was a beautiful, beautiful, huge, big hotel. Kind of 50 meters away was the beach. So it's picturesque, it's beautiful. The weather is amazing. So that's where they proceed to go and sit. In my body, it was, I can't sit over there. So I do say to them, we can't. And they say, what do you mean? So they proceed to go and sit on the table. So I am feeling this being torn in my body. I finally see that no one is paying attention to me, so I go and I join them at the table. But I sit on the edge of my seat. I am anxious as anything. I can't quite work out what's happening to me. Anyway, a few minutes later, a waiter approaches the table. In my head, I was as clear as day that he had come to tell us that we can't sit on the porch. So I promptly stood up, I walked away. No one was going to tell me not to sit on the porch. That had happened too many times for me. So I walked away. So the waiter had come to ask what people wanted to drink, right? So I watch this and I sheepishly go back to the table and I sit down. So of course everyone is working, I'm thinking, what is happening to me? So I just do realize that, okay, there's something really important happening here. So as I'm thinking about it now, actually it was a blessing that happened and that it happened in Ghana. So if this had happened in South Africa, or if it had happened in England that I'd visited for a short time before, or in America where I'd lived for a few years, I would have thought, yeah, makes sense. There's racism in those places, so it makes sense for you to feel like this. But this was happening in an African country that had been free for decades. There were hardly any white people around. The other black people happily sat on the porch. It was just me. And so it was clear to me that I needed that message to hit home clearly for me to get it. Because if it had been anywhere else, I wouldn't have got it. So I finished the training, I'm thinking, gosh, what is this? But whatever it is, I need to work on it. But then because I studied psychology, I thought, okay, what it is low self-esteem. You know, I need to work on my self-esteem. But I still feel that there's something that doesn't quite click. It's it, but it's more than it. So I decided, okay, so the TRC provided space for others. I need a space, so I'm going to go home, and I'm going to go start working on finding each other with white people. And my determination, white people need to understand where we've come from, because I don't think they have an understanding. So I came back home, and I started working like that. So facilitating diversity and being in conversation and trying to see each other with white people. Feeling like, is this solving, healing what I felt, but felt like it was okay, but it wasn't quite hitting home. So in 2008, I was studying process work psychology, and for the first time I came across a term that described my experience, internalized oppression. I thought, so that's what's happening. But what I was finding is that it was described as self-hate, right? So when you read up internalized oppression, it talks about self-loathing or self-hate. I said, there's something about that doesn't quite feel right. I don't hate myself. Do I hate myself? It's not quite, but maybe. So I was still wrestling with it. And as I think about it, and I was thinking about this quote by Steve Biko that says, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And I thought, oh gosh, that's what's happened to me, right? So they don't have to be anywhere, nearby. I'm in Ghana and I'm thinking those things about myself. But as I read more and more about internalized oppression, I was actually relieved to find that it's not just something that afflicts Black people, right? That it's something that people who've been marginalized experience, people from marginalized groups. So I learned that some women might experience internalized sexism or internalized misogyny, that some members of the LGBTQI++ community might experience internalized heterosexism, that some Jewish people, surprise, surprise, might experience internalized anti-Semitism. So there was something about this that really freed me in the way that just hearing the term hadn't. So it seemed to be a definition that was more holistic, that wasn't just like I hate myself, so there's something wrong with my psychology, but it was something about we grow up in environments that give us messages about ourselves. We take those messages on, we believe them, and then we act based upon those towards each other. The beliefs we form about ourselves, how we relate to others, and how we relate to the dominant group, be it men, be it white people, whatever the case may be. So there was something about this that was really liberating for me. I felt like for the first time, I could talk about this because it's not just my fault. It's just not my deficiency as this Black person in South Africa. So when we think about how does it manifest, what does it look like? Of course, there's many ways, but I just want to pick on the 3 areas. So we have negative attitudes about ourselves. And then we have negative attitudes towards people who are in our same group, people like us. And then we have these positive attitudes and actions towards people who are from the dominant group, be it men or white people. So just a few examples around negative attitudes towards ourselves. So one of the big things that I used to feel, I still feel, but not to the same degree, is self-doubt. So not just like low self-confidence, but crippling self-doubt. So when I went to the University of Natal, and for the first time I was in a class with white students, in a small psychology class, 12 students, only Black students, I was debilitated by my self-doubt. Now, of course, some of it was in the environment. So the institution, the lecturers, the students, they were all unconscious. But some of that I brought coming in. I really thought, I'm not going to cut it. I'm not intelligent enough. I'm going to fail. No one will listen to me. So I brought that in, coming in. And disliking ourselves. So the skin lightening creams, hating our broad noses, hating our thick lips, and constantly striving to be like the white people or the men. And a lot of shame that then comes with that. So if I'm not accepting who I am, I'm wanting to be the other, it's very shameful, right? And then in terms of how we relate with each other, so people like us, the negative attitudes. So the strange thing is that there are all these stereotypes about Black people in this case. And I don't believe that about me, but I'll believe it about you. So yeah, Black people are like that. I'm just the exception. But yeah, Black people, they are like that. So unfortunately, we undermine each other. We compete with each other, not just in a healthy way, but in a very unhealthy way. And we also displace our anger towards people like us. So we can't direct that to the people who are hurting us or oppressing us because of the power dynamic, but we do it amongst ourselves. In fact, I really believe that the xenophobia that's plagued South Africa in the past 10 years has its roots in internalized oppression. And then how we relate to the people above us, the dominant group, be it men or white people, is that we defer to them. We value their opinions more than we value our own or our peers. We prioritize their needs. I don't know who's had experience here of going to a supermarket, being attended by someone like you, and when a white person comes or a man comes, they leave you alone and they're attending to someone else. And that's someone exactly who looks like you. That's what happens. And we're constantly trying to get as close to white people as possible. Proximity whiteness opens doors, and we do that to ourselves. So for me, one of the things I was puzzling is, why don't we talk about it? Why is it a dirty legal secret? And if I think about myself, for me the big thing was the shame. I was ashamed to admit to the fact that I feel that about myself, and therefore about others. So I had to keep it under wraps and not talk about it. But this was when I really thought that it's me, it's my psychology, there's something wrong about me. So the impact of internalized oppression, I think there's a lot of studies that talk about the fact that, in fact, people from marginalized groups disproportionately have more mental health difficulties. If you're constantly stressing, constantly competing, constantly feeling self-doubt, there is no way you can live to your fullest potential. And that process then keeps the structures of inequality in place, unfortunately. So if we're thinking about how we can heal from it, what do we do to heal from it? Carl Jung has this quote that I really like. He says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, right? So the first thing is name it. Let's call it. Let's say this is what's happening. Let's talk about it. Let it not be just a dirty little secret that I admit to when I'm when I'm by myself in the bathroom. But let's talk about it. Let's build awareness about it so people know that in fact it's not your fault. It's not just your problematic psychology. That there's an environment that's created this. The social, political, economic environment has given you these messages about yourself. And then we must notice the patterns. So at the beginning of this year, I ran a series of focus groups with Black women trying to wrestle with this. What is this thing? What does it look like? How do you experience it? And the first task was just to notice it. So notice when it happens. Notice when you feel that about yourself. Notice when you feel that about someone like you. Notice how you're feeling about the people from the dominant group, because that's where then you can begin to interrupt those patterns and give yourself different messages. We need to affirm the best in ourselves. I think that the messages that we've gotten about ourselves is that we're not good enough. We need to communicate different messages. And also just have compassion, right? So compassion for ourselves and compassion for each other. So as we're striving towards equality, social justice activism is really, really important. We need to focus on the structures and try and break them down. But we also have to do inner work. Because if we don't do that, should we get to equality, when we get to equality, you will find that we're still unequal because of the messages that we've ingested. So I'll leave you with a question. In what ways are you contributing to inequality by turning a blind eye to internalized oppression? Thank you.